All right. We start our next chapter, if you want to call it a chapter, but our next subject or topic, whatever terminology works for you, by taking a look at federalism. Now, federalism is a concept we've talked about actually quite a bit to this point. We talked about when we talked about the mistrusting government that's inherent in the Constitution. We talked about it a little bit when we talked about the nuts and bolts of the Constitution itself. And of course, in the discussion of the Constitutional Convention, finding the proper balance between state power and federal power was a subject that certainly came up, and you could argue, I think defensively and credibly, that it was the primary issue that came up during that time. So, what we're going to look at to start this discussion of federalism is we're going to look at systems of government. Now, when we say systems of government, what we're talking about is structural. In short, where are you going to have decision-making authority lie? Do you want your power to be centralized in a single large government? Do you want your power decentralized in a large number, a multiplicity of smaller governments? Or perhaps you want something in between. That is the dividing line. That's when we talk about federalism or unitary systems or confederal governments or what have you. That's what we're talking about. When we talk about systems of government, we're talking about them as organizing principles, okay? And when I say organizing principles, what I mean is, how are you going to structure this thing? A government is going to be endowed with a certain amount of power. Where are you going to put that power? Are you going to disperse it? Are you going to centralize it? Are you going to put it in one set of hands, many set of hands? Are you going to find a way to balance those competing interests? There's a lot of questions there. This is not something that is inherently a given. There's a lot of different ways to arrive at this same solution. How are you going to allow your government to exercise power? Now, as it happens, the United States has had experience with all three of the predominant or most common structural systems of government. Now, it must be noted, only one of the three was completely involuntary. Two of the three we chose, and we'll get to those a little later down the line, but we'll start with the one that we never actually chose for ourselves. It was imposed upon us. And of course, that means that when we talk about this first system, this first structure of government, we're going to be looking at something that harkens back to our colonial era. And that is what's known as a unitary system. Now, unitary comes from, the nice thing about the unitary system, in terms of trying to define it and understand it in the context of study, is simply this. It is really easy to understand because the word is really easy to understand. Unitary, unit, una. If I ride a bike with one tire or wheel, I got a unicycle. If I'm wearing, a one-piece thing, I'm wearing a unitard. By the way, you will never, ever see me living or dead wearing a unitard. Just, to ease your mind on that particular topic. So unitary government is a government that's comprised of a single structure. Now, if it's comprised of a single structure and you've got a large populous state, as we do, then when you're talking about a unitary system in the context of the United States, you're talking about a single, large, national governmental structure. Now, for each of these three systems as we go along, by the way, and unlike a lot of the lecture notes we do, this one's going to be relatively short. This is not going to be a 35-minute or a 40-minute exercise, which I'm sure the dude in the hotel room next to me is happy about, because he's not going to hear my voice rambling for 40 minutes on end. Yes, when I'm out of town enjoying myself, I always come back to teaching and government and history and stuff. It's what I do. It's sad and pathetic, but it's who I am, damn it. But anyway, this is going to probably be closer to the 15, 20-minute range. But anyhow, for each of these three systems we're going to discuss today, we're going to look at the positives and the negatives. So let's start with the positives of a unitary system. The positive of the unitary system is because laws are one size fits all, they all emanate from the same place, they tend to be uniform laws and therefore easier to enforce. So I'll give you an example. of the opposite of that. When it comes to the subject of guns, there are parts of the United States where gun ownership is strongly curtailed, or gun purchase is strongly curtailed. Famously, Chicago, Illinois was a quote-unquote gun-free zone, or still is, I think. But did you know, and you probably don't, that there are two cities in America where gun ownership is not only, of course, acceptable under the Second Amendment, it's mandated. Virgin, Utah, which is right at the entrance to Zion National Park, and I believe it's Peachtree City, Georgia is the other one. It's a suburb of Atlanta. I think it's Peachtree City, Georgia. Have city ordinances that require a firearm to be in the domicile of all persons living within the borders of the community. And sure enough, if you go to Virgin, Utah, one of the things you'll notice, I shit you not, is you'll see that a lot of the stop signs have bullet holes in them. And maybe that's a coincidence. It is kind of out in the country, but it's pretty wild. Hey, they require guns here, and wow, there's a lot of bullet holes in that stop sign. That yield sign is yielding about 25 holes in it. So in a large nation like ours, that lack of uniformity can be confusing, to be sure. What applies to one state may not apply to another. What is a law in one city may not be a law that applies to another. In a unitary system, this isn't a problem. Laws are uniform, they're easier to enforce, and they're easier for those who have a penchant for obeying laws, which hopefully most people do in a civil society. They're easier to obey. So, for example, and again, I'm giving you a peek behind the curtain here, I am not in our lovely home base of the South Bay right now. I'm actually 2,500 miles away in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. I'm at a teaching conference, and I rented a car because I'm cheap, so I flew into Newark rather than an airport a little closer to where I am. I'm about 25 miles outside of Gettysburg, for those of you that are not familiar with Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. So I rented a car to drive through, and as I'm driving, and I'll see state troopers on the side of the road, even though I'm driving roughly the speed limit or I'm doing X, Y, and Z, I still get nervous because I don't know all the traffic laws of New Jersey or all the traffic laws of Pennsylvania. They have laws we don't have. I know we have laws that they don't have. If I'm on, if I'm looking at my phone to look at the map and I'm not texting with it or utilizing it, am I breaking the law here? I know I'm in California because I just got a ticket for that damn thing not that long ago. Yeah, that sucked. We won't talk about that. So ultimately, that is a positive in a unitary system. No confusion. If you're in Japan, whatever's passed down from the Diet, the law is the same in Honshu as it is in Hokkaido. Now, the negative of that system, and it's why we have never voluntarily exercised it here in the United States, is unitary systems have a horrible time dealing with diversity. So I go back to guns. Why does Chicago have one law on guns and Virgin, Utah, or Peachtree City, Georgia, or Texas have entirely and wildly different rules on guns? Well, because the role of the gun in the society is so different place to place. And I'll give you an example that I find amusing, and hopefully you will too. So I grew up with you guys. I grew up in Manhattan Beach. I went to Maricosta, for those who don't know. Grew up here. My brother and I both went to Costa. Met my wife at Costa, the whole 9 yards, right? So I'm a very South Bay-centric, Maricosta-centric person and family. So I grew up in Southern California. My only experiences with guns, aside from one trip target shooting with my brother-in-law, who was a target shooter. We went to a range in Van Nuys. I sucked. I thought I'd shot, they moved the target towards you, and I saw 5 holes in the paper, which was problematic because I'd fired about 12 shots. So the fact there were only 5 holes in the paper means that 7 of them were lodged in the ballistics gel behind. Your boy was not very good. Aside from that one event on one day when I was 17, all my other experiences with guns have pretty well sucked. There was a drive-by shooting at a football game where my brother was coaching, and I happened to be at that game. It was at Washington Prep High School over not far from Florence and Normandy, where the 1992 Los Angeles riots began. There was an armed robbery at a gas station where I was at a red light, The shots were fired literally 15 to 20 feet away from me. Ran the red light the second I heard the shots, and I think I had about a 1983 Nissan at that point. You'd be amazed how quickly you can go to 0-60 if you really have your heart set on it and your foot set on it. And then aside from that, I had a gun brought to my classroom my second year teaching. Not in any way directed towards me. It was actually the kid had gotten threatened by another kid in his art class and decided to show that he was really a lot tougher than he looked by bringing a gun to school. That was an ill-advised move, by the way. I do not recommend. So my experiences with guns are not great. Oh, I had guns pointed at me by the police department once because I'm an idiot and I didn't know that you're not supposed to get out of the car when you get pulled over. This is when I was 18. So yeah, add that one to the list. That sucked. Point is, my experience with guns are all bad. So if they want to legislate guns, I'm down, right? Because that's my learned experience. That's what I know. Contrast that with my mom. My mom grew up in Navarro County, Texas, rural, central Texas. As a song once said, this must be the place where rednecks come from. And indeed they do. The first time my mom held a gun in her hands, young scholars, she was 4. She was hunting at the age of 4. I don't think we let either of our children commandeer the remote control on the TV set when they were 4. We didn't give them access to the computer keyboard when they were 4. My mom was holding a small but real shotgun at the age of 4. Why? Because hunting and gun sports are lifeblood in many parts of the country. We got a high school program from the high school that she would go to today. The school she went to closed years ago. But the school where she would have gone today. And they do little senior profiles like we do for our football program, very similar. What was your best experience? What have you learned from, the sport or what have you? And one of the questions they always ask is, what's your favorite hobby? And I see some of our kids ask that in the Costa football program, and it's surfing or hockey or volleyball or, hanging out with my friends or, whatever. History and government, okay, that one's never been on there, not once. In Hubbard High School in Hubbard, Texas, every kid, with one exception, and he put cars and girls, what a tool, put hunting and fishing. Every single one, no exceptions. So how are you going to make a gun law if you have a one-size-fits-all government like a unitary system? How are you going to make a gun law that people both in California, Southern California, and Central Texas can respect? You can't. It's impossible. It's fundamentally impossible because the views on the subject are so diverse. Any law that Southern Californians would find acceptable, Texans would probably have a very hard time with, or at least rural Texans would. I'm not talking about Dallas, Houston, San Antonio. I'm certainly not talking about Austin. I'm talking about the place where my mom grew up, right? Out in the rural part of the state. They're not going to be okay with any gun restrictions. So for this system to work, and we've always been the most diverse large state in world history, as I've said many, many times in these lectures, for this to work, you need a nation that has a certain level of social or societal sameness or conformity. Certainly true in Japan. There used to be a Japanese proverb, the translation of which was, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down, which means you generally don't go against the grain. The United Kingdom had a tremendous cultural sameness, although that has really declined in a very real way in the last 20, 30, 40 years. So it'll be interesting to see where that nation goes from here. But up till this point, there's been enough cultural sameness that this kind of system works. But for us, it was never going to work. Because as we've talked about in this class, and if you had me for A-Push, we talked about it there too, this is the kind of place that has always been diverse. Even when we're just 13 petty little republics, the colonies were very diverse. What was working in Georgia, what was acceptable in Georgia, what was prized in Georgia was not prized in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, and vice versa. So where did we start? Well, we already talked about this, but you know where I'm headed with this. We have the confederal system, or a confederation. In a confederal system, the center of decision-making authority is in a series of smaller regional, we also sometimes use the word state and colonial governments, each with their own autonomy, each with their own set of specific powers. If you have a national government at all, and most do, it is blessed with very little power, and it is given limited, very limited authority over the states. The states are sort of the center of governance, if you will. Now, positive of this system is it works well in diverse environments. It allows for greater flexibility in the law. When I was in Iowa, this was several years ago, we got to talking with a lady in a shop. I do that a lot. I'm awkwardly social. And she found out I was a teacher, asked what I taught, and I told her I taught social studies. And she said, we have social studies for 3 years here. And I said, oh, that's great. I go, what do you do the fourth year? And the answer was that it was a graduation requirement. This was in western Iowa, kind of the more rural part of Iowa. It was a graduation requirement in Iowa that you take some sort of year-long class in farm science, farm management, some agricultural subject to graduate high school, because so many of those kids were going to go into farming or management of farms, or something of that nature. Now, of course, we could never do that in California, and you wouldn't want to. In Maricosta, there's not a lot of farming that's going on, at least not a lot that's legal. So probably not a need for Farm Science 101. Same thing works in other aspects of education, right? In California, we have bilingual education. Well, in a state where 50% of your student body began their lives speaking a language other than English, well, by God, that probably makes sense to have bilingual education. But in New Hampshire, which is 97% white, and where the second most common language is actually French, because of the proximity to Quebec, probably not as much need for bilingual education. So in a confederal system, if California wants to have bilingual education, it doesn't hold North Dakota to it. If Iowa wants to have agricultural classes, it doesn't hold New York City to it. It gives that flexibility. Another advantage of the confederal system, which is a huge part of why we utilized it here in the United States for the first 7 years of our post-revolutionary era, is because it is more trusted by citizens skeptical of authority. There isn't a distant authority that makes rules that they'll never see nor understand. Power rests closer to them because the governing, such as it is done at the state, at the county, at the community level. So, why don't we still have this system? Well, we talked about this when we talked about the Articles of Confederation in the last chapter. First of all, it's very difficult to act on items which require a large response. In a country our size, you are sometimes going to have to speak with one voice, and in a confederation, it renders it pretty darn close to impossible to do that, right? As I said in the lecture on the Articles of Confederation, if an enterprising foreign power had decided to invade the United States in 1785, they may not have had a lot of difficulty. The second problem with a confederal system is it generally makes it impossible to create a national identity. So I talked about this when I talked about the Articles of Confederation as well, that the historian Gordon Wood noted once that in the colonial era, people would introduce themselves by saying, I am from the nation of Pennsylvania. A little shout out to the state where I am right now. Or I'm from the nation of North Carolina. And that's all well and good, but here's where that's a problem. National identity creates national willingness to sacrifice. And there's going to be times where if you are a nation, that's going to be necessary. And I give you as an example something that happened before your time, and that blows me away that it was before your time. I was already married with kids. 9/11. When 9/11 occurred, as I think I said in a previous lecture actually, the headlines in the newspaper didn't say New York attacked or Pennsylvania attacked or Northern Virginia attacked. It said America under attack. And of course, when there came time to be a military response, and we're not here to debate the wisdom of the military strategy from 2001 to 2006, but when it came time for a military response, volunteers signed up for the forces from all over the country. Most famously, NFL safety Pat Tillman, who was from Arizona, well, originally from California, and then went to college and played professional football in Arizona, signs up with his brother for the military. they weren't from where the 9/11 attacks occurred. In fact, as far as I know, they didn't know anybody who was harmed in those attacks. It was the national identity. You can call it patriotism, you can call it whatever you want, but at a basic level, it's a national identity. It's an understanding that we're all part of the same fabric that makes us willing to sacrifice. And it doesn't have to be war. In national disasters, right? Natural disasters, excuse me. I can say words. When Hurricane Katrina hits the Gulf Coast, in those horrible occasions when California is ravaged by fire, right? Generally speaking, it's a foregone conclusion that the nation will come together and help those in need. I say it's a foregone conclusion. It doesn't always happen. President Trump rather famously threatened to withhold aid from the horrific fires in 2019 in California on the grounds that California didn't vote for him. The irony, the hardest hit city, a city called Paradise, California, up near Chico, was actually heavily Republican, a very red part of the state. And yes, there are red parts of California. So there's a little bit of irony that people that almost certainly voted for him were originally threatened to get shafted by him because he thought that they weren't on his side, and they actually were. But generally speaking, when we have disasters of that scope, whether it's a hurricane, a string of tornadoes, fire, drought, whatever the case may be, flooding, as we saw in Vermont in the summer of 2023, we come together. You don't do that if your country is not America, but rather my country, North Carolina. Which brings us to the system we do utilize. By the way, example, Switzerland, kind of. Switzerland's the closest thing we have to a confederation. They're technically a federal system, which we'll get to in a moment, but they give a lot of power to their local governments. And the reason why is because Switzerland makes us look conformist by nature. 4 different official languages in a state whose population and geographic sizes closely rivals Connecticut. Okay? 4 different official languages. So, yeah, obviously you want to give the the German part of the country probably a different set of laws than the French side of the country because culturally they were raised in very different ways. And of course the United States, 1781, 1787, but we've already been over that. Let's turn to the federal system. And in a federal system, the center of decision-making authority is either balanced, divided, take whatever term you want to use, between a single national government that we call the federal government, federal system, federal government, and a series of subnational governments. I say a series because it's not just one place. You have states, counties, cities. You have elected boards of governments for certain regions. We have a community college district that covers Elko and I think also West Los Angeles City College or something along those lines. You have water quality or water basin district that covers most of the South Bay. You have state assembly, you have state senate, you have the county board of supervisors, the city council, the Manhattan Beach Unified School Board. You have so many examples of overlapping layers of government. So what's the positive? Well, the positive is when we need to speak with one voice, we can. Whether it's a declaration of war or the imposition of Social Security in 1935, Medicare in the 1960s, when it is determined that we need to have something as one nation speaking with one voice, we can do that. But at the same time, we can respect diverse needs by allowing real decisions with real consequences to be made at a subnational level. So if the state of California wants to, as an example, legalize recreational marijuana, they can without forcing Arizona to do so. If Arizona wants to change its housing laws, they can do that without subjecting New Mexico to their demands. If Texas wants to expand gun ownership, they can do so without making Illinois have to do it. So what are the negatives? Well, the biggest negative is actually probably the negative of confusion. When multiple people are in charge, then it may become difficult to understand a chain of command or a chain of actually who makes the final call on something. This was brought to specific example, tragically, in the year 2005, a year that a lot of you guys were born in, with Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf Coast. So you have disaster response agencies at the state and local level. Almost every city of size has an Office of Emergency Management, for example. States have some equivalent. And of course, at the federal level, we have one as well. It's called FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So Hurricane Katrina hits in the late summer of 2005, like nothing we've really ever seen. There have been stronger hurricanes that have hit the United States, but very few that hit effectively a direct hit on one of the 40 largest cities in America. At least it was at the time. I don't know if it is anymore. So many people left after the hurricane. So anyhow, in the days following the storm, there becomes this, when two people want to exert power, we call it a power struggle. So I don't know what term we would use for when two sides ostensibly have power and neither will exercise it or can exercise it. FEMA is very slow to respond. Now, for a lot of reasons. But the biggest one almost certainly is this was like nothing anyone had ever experienced before in terms of size, scope. The severe damage spread was over 4 states. There was severe damage, 5 actually, all the way from the very westernmost part of Florida through Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and even the easternmost part of Texas was deluged with rain. So there was response that was needed over about, I want to say about 300-400 miles of coastline. And so no one had ever seen anything like this. They were slow to respond. But the bigger problem was, in a kind of face-saving gesture, the federal government at the time basically said, well, there's certain procedures the state really needs to follow for this to work. Well, here's the problem with that. It's a little hard for the New Orleans Emergency Management Office to really get up and running when it's under 5 feet of water. Or 12 feet of water, whatever the case may have been. I think it was actually closer to 12 feet. And so you've got the state and local governmental agencies, particularly the state agencies, Louisiana, blaming the federal government. You got the federal government blaming Louisiana. And it took actually a bizarre turn. About 5 days after the hurricane, the mayor of New Orleans went on to CNN as just a caller. He called in, I think it was a federal official, might have even been the FEMA director, was on the show, on the program. And he calls in and basically starts dog cussing everybody. I don't care who's at fault. I don't care who's responsible. Someone needs to come and bleeping help us. But it doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution that when a tragic act of God comes to a place, here's the line of authority or here's the organizational flow chart. That doesn't exist. And that's when there's genuine good faith, we would like to hope and think, about how to proceed. What if there's not? That's another negative of the federal system. Giving the states real power gives them a chance to deny clear national goals in terms of selfish interest. Look at civil rights. For decades, even more, there were communities in Texas that were not integrated till I was in college. I didn't go to college till 1991. Vidor, Texas, which is a smallish city outside Beaumont, Texas, southeastern part of the state, fairly close to the Louisiana border, it didn't integrate till 1993. Okay? I was just talking with somebody today at this teaching conference where I am. Their school, she was the first one to be integrated in her school district in 1982. So Brown is in 54. Keep that in mind. So what the heck happened? Well, when you give states and local governments authority, they can abuse that authority. They can do things like, and you'll see this in the film we're going to watch later on, the governor of Arkansas saying, I know they want us to integrate. I know they have a federal court order. And I know the Brown case has been adjudicated, but it just seems a little too dangerous to me. And I am, as the governor of the state, I'm in charge of preserving the peace and the safety of the people of my capital city of Little Rock. So, yeah, we're not going to integrate because it's just too darn dangerous. Now, was he full of shit? Yeah, as you'll see when we watch the film. But public safety is not a federal priority. It is a state and local priority. We don't have, we have the FBI, I get that, but when you get, pulled over for driving too fast, or, you get arrested for having, cocaine, well, not you nor me, but somebody gets arrested for having cocaine, it's usually not the FBI doing it, unless you're doing international trafficking, right? It's a state police department, or it's a city or a county police force or sheriff's department or what have you, right? So public safety is generally a local issue. And so they milked that for a good long while. And as you'll see, they were able to carry this charade on for years in some places and decades in others. And that is, while it's the best system we've got for the reasons stated earlier, that is a clear flaw in the federal system. All right, we're good to go. I said 20, it wound up being 30 minutes and 30 seconds. Sue me. All right, you guys, be good. I'll talk to you next time.